The mayor has requested that an interim council chair be, interim mayor be appointed to run tonight's meeting. So we'll start that by asking if there are any nominations.
Motion for Alicia Ray, Councilor Ray.
Okay, there's motion and second for Councilor Ray. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, all those in favor so indicate. Motion passes.
Great. So we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So we're here for a work session tonight. The first item is the recycling committee, and we have Teddy and John joining us. Thanks.
So I'm Teddy Price-Wharf, and I'm representing the City of Lewiston Recycling and Waste Management Committee, and we're here to talk about the Recycling Reform for Maine proposal. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm a very nervous public speaker, so I'm going to try to stay on task here. So this, hopefully you have in your packets, this is the proposal. It's a resolve for, in support of the Recycling Reform for Maine proposition having to do with the management of packaging waste and producer responsibility. We have a number of other towns who have already passed a resolution in support, so we would not be alone. This resolve comes in support of Maine LD 1431, which was passed last spring. And basically the highlights of that are to provide for the establishment of a nonprofit stewardship organization of producers of packaging to support the state's municipal solid waste management programs. And the Department of Environmental Protection shall submit a proposal of legislation to the Committee on the Environment and Natural Resources by December. So basically, in summary, the Maine legislators will be voting on a specific proposal concerning recycling reform in the 2020 legislative session. So this is, again, to support their work on that. So just briefly what a stewardship program is. So extended producer responsibility programs provide incentives for producers to make product design changes that would reduce waste management costs. They focus on product recyclability and reducing material use. The objective is to decrease the total environmental impact of products and to have the producers take some responsibility for the life cycle of the materials that they're producing. So we already have several product stewardship programs in Maine. The most familiar one is probably for redeemable beverage containers. That's been around since the 70s. But also, as you can see, mercury thermostats, fluorescent light bulbs, electronic waste, cell phones and rechargeable batteries, and paint and paint containers are all also part of that stewardship program collection. All right. Just a moment here. So there are basically a couple of thoughts about stewardship programs. The two main benefits, one is to reduce the cost to residents and municipalities in terms of dealing with materials that have been produced and disposing of the waste and or managing their recycling. And then the other main goal is better in general for the long-term health and well-being of the environment by encouraging less production and more responsible types of materials, improving the earth that we leave for our children, grandchildren, etc. So this is around the world, different places that have various forms of legislation, mandatory and voluntary programs for extended producer responsibility involving packaging waste. So there's a lot of precedent for this. There have been a lot of successful programs. In your packet, I believe there's information about a number of different companies in Quebec that are all involved in doing the extended producer responsibility for recycled packaging materials. Does anyone else want to chime in here with anything I left out? Okay. Do you want to, we have one final thought, if you want to? Yeah. Okay, and one more thought to leave you with. Go ahead. Take over. I won't run away.
Hello. What this, oh, I'm sorry, my apologies. I'm Joshua Najin. I live at 108 Spring Street, and I'm on the recycling committee. This is a resolve to establish November 15th as America Recycles Day in Lewiston, Maine. This is actually a program of Keep America Beautiful, but there are several municipalities and states that already follow this program. All it is a resolve to say, this is the day that we acknowledge and celebrate the practice of recycling. For this cycle through, obviously, November 15th coming right up, so I imagine there wouldn't be much to be done this year, but going forward, the hope would be that we could build on educational programs, participation, from, voluntary participation from the municipality, businesses, etc. And does anybody have any questions about that at all?
What was that?
Does anybody have any questions about the resolve? Yeah.
Counselor Beam.
I think I wouldn't have a question, right, since I've been working with, but this is something that has to do more with the way the committee works. Is it possible to have that resolve signed by the counselors before the 15th, which is Friday?
So we were just discussing that. That's a great
You
question.
were, yeah.
So we were going to ask the city administrator, is this something that the mayor can just sign since we cannot vote tonight?
The
As we are
mayor
not-
could certainly sign a proclamation.
Okay, and that's what this appears to be.
So we could just reformat this as a mayoral proclamation, have her issue it, and cover it that
Sound
way.
amenable to the mayor? Yes, great.
And then maybe bring it back formally a year from now when, again.
Yeah,
and
that
have
would be
the
great
council
for
address it.
council.
As long as these folks remind us.
Well, the hope is that we'll have a little more than just the proclamation by
Right,
next year.
exactly,
So we'll have time and opportunity to do that.
Counselor Beam.
I had one more question, and that's to Josh. I know I asked you that, I'm probably putting you on the spot, I hope not. I asked you that at the last meeting, but I was thinking about it, and I thought there's not much we can do this year because we just found out about it, and we didn't have time to do any educational things, but now you said you got a site for our.
Yeah, I just
that's
purchased
not
the
gonna work
domain
out.
based on some of the work that the Recycling and Waste Management Committee has been looking at. But yeah, that could be made available.
On Friday? You mean like
Not
that?
on Friday, no,
Okay.
you have to actually build a website, it's just a domain name, so, but yeah, but it's sustainablelewiston.com, and the thought behind it would be reducing the amount of trash that actually goes in the waste stream, total, putting more of the recycling, actually participating in recycling and making sure it's not getting burned. Taking biogenic waste, keeping that out of the trash flow as well. And so it'd be more of a sustainable look as opposed to a recycling look. But just coming back to Teddy's presentation really quickly, the recycling reform for Maine proposition basically passes the responsibility, the fiscal responsibility to the producers, to the manufacturers. So what we're talking about is Amazon, for instance, and I think everybody's experienced this. You order something that is this big, and you have a package that shows up at your house that's like this large, right? We have no control over what the manufacturers actually use for packaging. We either can choose to buy the product or not buy the product. And the end result is the taxpayer foots the bill on that. We pay for the tipping fees. We pay for the disposal fees, the collection. So this resolve basically says we're going to pass a small tax onto the manufacturer in order to sell this product in the state of Maine. And the way that it works is if they being the manufacturer, and when I say small tax, I'm talking about percentages of a penny per shipping, which is huge for us when you look at how much it costs to actually dispose of trash on your tax bill. So there are levers in place, hopefully, that will push manufacturers to make more ecologically friendly packaging, so that, for instance, instead of using styrofoam, you're using a corn-based packaging that can actually dissolve, things like this. So this actually is a proposal that has no cost to the city at all, and the hope is that if we can put it in place and make it work, that it will actually reduce our costs for disposing of the trash that we have to deal with just by consuming. So just wanted to point that out real quick.
So some exciting news. It appears the mayor has signed the proclamation already. So we'll pass that to the city administrator. And who will that be distributed to?
We can put it certainly out on our website, we can put it on our social media and make it available to the newspaper and other media.
And who does it get returned to?
So I was also going to mention, so if Maine, if the state legislature does pass an initiative with this, that would make Maine the first state in the union to do so. Again, you know, our neighbors to the north have done that and all over the world, but we could be, once again, trendsetters in terms of doing something that would help us for the whole future of managing waste materials.
So the proclamation to establish America Recycles Day, who does that need to go back to? Do you know? Josh?
Yeah.
You want it? Great. We'll get that to you. And then the other, so there's two resolves in the package, just to be clear. One was the America Recycles, and the other is what the legislature is acting upon. Okay, great. Further questions for these folks or other members of the recycling committee? Comments? Councilor Marcotte?
Is this the extent of the conversation on this item? Or is there more to come?
So,
I think that's basically the presentation. What we'd be looking for is some direction from the council, whether they wanted to see the recycling reform for Maine resolve on the agenda at the next meeting or not.
Okay, because I have a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
We appear to have been discussing the proclamation, which I have no objection to. However, there's a lot of detail here on the other one or two. I thought it was one, but I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's one, yeah.
it's
But
two.
we put aside the proclamation, and we're back to the reform proposal.
Okay. There's a reference to emergency, and in our proposed resolve. However, the language in the proposed state statute refers to no emergency, so there's a little bit of a conflict there. And there's a lot of detail in here as to, I'm not sure how the state would implement something like this when most manufacturers manufacture outside the state. And you mentioned taxing a few seconds ago, and sorry if I missed it, but I didn't read any language about taxing in this afternoon.
All right, so, yeah, let me just go back through, because I did kind of breeze through the different portions of this. So, so the Maine LD 1431, the resolve has already passed. I think you got that point, and the next step of this is that there's legislation in development. In terms of the state of Maine, that's why we brought up the example of Quebec as a province, which is, you know, as a comparative body, that this seems to be something that has worked very well in terms of buy-in of producers. So it becomes and I don't know if anybody else has an articulate way of explaining that, but in terms of the manufacturer,
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, it's the same concept.
Josh, could you just use a mic?
yeah, comes once.
It's the same concept as the sales tax. How do we collect the sales tax? When you send product into the state, there's, hold on, Chrissy's telling me I'm wrong. Do you want to talk? Yeah.
So just one thing that the member of the legislature who also sits on this body just let me know is that this has been signed by Governor Mills already, and the emergency clause was taken out as an amendment before it passed. That's helpful to you, Councilor Marcotte.
Right now, a lot of the levers aren't in place because the Maine DEP has to come back with the suggestions on how all of that works, and how it actually affects individual businesses. So there are portions, all we're saying in the resolve is that we're asking the city of Lewiston to support the concept of taxing, or excuse me, not taxing, but passing the cost of disposal onto the manufacturer as opposed to the consumer. So that's basically what it is.
Did you have further questions, Councilor Marcotte?
Well, I'm just hearing now that the governor passed, or signed a resolve, you said, or proclamation?
It's already law. So if you look at the packet,
Well, there was an additional piece,
the one that got sent via email,
The one that starts with the list of town and municipality names has the,
well, I'm seeing this for the first time this evening.
well,
that
we
came
got
via
an
email.
Yes, it came in late Friday and was emailed out, but I brought hard copies for tonight.
So there's two things. There's the original bill, and then there's the committee amendment, which stripped out the emergency legislation language. And that is what was signed by Governor Mills on May 30th, 2019. So this is currently law.
So what are we being asked to do in passing a resolve at a future meeting then?
The legislation basically directed the Department of Environmental Protection to come back to the legislature in January with a proposed piece of legislation that would institute a program on producer responsibility for packaging. That bill would then go through the legislative process and be looked at, public hearings and all those kinds of things, and adopted. I believe what this proposal is for the city council to take a position supporting, as was mentioned, the concept of a producer responsibility approach to packaging, recognizing that the details are not yet known. It will depend on what comes to the legislature in
So
January
we
and what
must
comes
vote on
out.
something before we know what's in it. Is that what you're telling me?
I would think what I'm telling you is the concept and recognizing that the details haven't come out yet, and there's no necessity that supporting a concept of something requires supporting a specific bill that might have details in it that were objectionable.
Okay. Well, what I find objectionable is signing on to something we don't know the details for. And maybe I'm better understanding, excuse me, the language on emergency, because apparently the previous legislation that was passed had an emergency clause that was stripped from it before it was passed. So that is separate and independent of this resolve, which has an emergency clause to it, which, as long as it proceeded through the process accordingly and with support from the various municipalities.
So there's a couple of things in these packets. And Sarah, did you want to speak to this with your work in the legislature? Would that be helpful? That'd be great, yeah, if you could clarify for Councilor Marcotte's points that he's making. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for inviting me up to speak. My name is Sarah Nichols, and I'm the Sustainable Maine Director for the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and I'm very involved in this policy, which is why I'm here to answer questions. So I'm happy to do so. As far as the emergency part goes, that's just something that was on the initial legislation that was drafted for that resolve, the LD 1431, and it was unnecessary to have that on. All an emergency does is puts a law into effect immediately instead of the 90 days standard after a bill is signed, and that was unnecessary for this, so they just took it off. The resolution that the city council
Is
is.
that this one?
That one, yeah,
The
it's
recycling
just,
bill.
is simply, so NRCM, we put that together as simply a way that we could collect a list of towns that supports this concept in the most official way. This was just a way to say, oh, this town supports it because everybody signed it, rather than just talking to a city administrator or a public works director and seeing it without having full council. So it's just a way to get added to a list of cities who support it, and it's not to say that you necessarily support the legislation. However, the legislation itself is designed to assist municipalities. That's pretty much the entire point, other than trying to increase recycling and change the design of packaging. It's to help municipalities with the huge financial burden of managing packaging waste. So it's hard to imagine that cities would be opposed. And the other reason that we are talking to municipalities ahead of time is because so many towns are struggling with recycling right now. We want to be able to say, help is coming, this is the type of policy, and since it is rather complicated and kind of game-changing, we wanted to make sure everybody kind of knew about it coming through. So that's kind of the whole setup, I guess. And then I'm happy to talk about how the producers pay into the system, too, with the fees. So the way these work all over the world is there's a producer responsibility organization that forms. It's a nonprofit stewardship organization that's funded by the producers. We do this for all kinds of different materials that were mentioned earlier, like paint, for instance. Paint Care has a nonprofit stewardship organization, and it has a board of directors that would have municipal representation, say environmental representation on that would help. And their whole role is to collect the fees from the producers based on the packaging that they're selling into Maine that fit the criteria of packaging, which is basically all the recyclable materials that wrap a product that are destined for Maine's municipal recycling programs. It's all the stuff that's destined to go home to the consumer. There'll be a specific definition when the statute comes out. And so that organization collects all the fees from all the producers and then distributes the funds raised to municipalities. It reimburses municipalities for costs of recycling when there are costs of recycling. Say if there are some years where municipalities are making a ton of money from recycling because they're changing their packaging into valuable materials, then there would be less to pay to municipalities because they wouldn't need it. It's almost like an insurance policy for our recycling programs. In Quebec, for instance, they've had their program in place for 15 years. And just recently with the market shakeups, Maine's municipalities are struggling and abandoning their programs left and right. Nothing happened in Quebec. They all stayed the exact same because they have this in place. And the producers almost had a rainy day fund to cover those costs. So they were able to have more sustainable programs going forward. So here, for instance, we have to be at the whims of the market, and communities might say, all right, well, recycle this year, but not next year, and it's confusing, more confusing than it has to be.
Two things. So if I understand correctly, this is the resolve we're talking about that you're looking for the city of Lewiston to sign on to. At this particular page, it's referred to as a resolve, is not the one that we'd be looking at.
That's correct.
That added to the confusion.
Yeah, if the pages had been numbered or something, that might have been easier, because this is what went through the legislative process.
But just thinking about what was said here, as far as passing the costs on to manufacturers or producers, not long ago, we had, I may label it incorrectly, but some sort of bottle bill or beverage bill, which was not the 5-cent return, but another particular item that was going to be dependent on how much volume a producer created and came into the state. It was particularly not liked by people along the border because it impacted people that purchased their beverages from New Hampshire and brought them into the state, Elliott, along York and Cumberland counties and such. I mean, we shouldn't illusion ourselves that passing on a tax to a producer isn't going to end up being borne by the end user in one form or another. Alternative methods for producing packaging could end up being more expensive than what's currently in use today. Doesn't mean that there's going to be an automatic savings. So these are things to all consider in the process. I'm just a little apprehensive of signing on to something that's going to suggest to the state, create a new tax, pass it along, and maybe nobody will notice if it's not coming from the pocket that everybody notices. That's my concern here.
Thanks, Councilor Marcotte. Any further questions or comments? Councilor Pattengill.
Just echo some of the sentiments Councilor Marcotte said. I'm all for recycling. I recycle a lot, both at my home and my business. I'm a little concerned that Maine's going to be the first in the nation to do this. I don't really think that compared to a company like Amazon, that Maine's going to sway how they package their materials. Well, I'm all for this. Some other things to consider. Schools recycle a lot of those unrecyclable materials from styrofoam meat containers, egg cartons. They get used in all kinds of projects all the time. We've also seen a shift where when I grew up, when you went to the grocery store, you got big giant paper bags to bring your groceries home in. And then all of a sudden we had to save the trees, and the solution to fix that was plastic bags. Now those are in the oceans, and so whatever the next big fix is, metal straws. We don't know what that's going to take us, but we haven't found a reasonable solution to this. I am alarmed that we're creating another tax to create a barrier to doing business in Maine. I think it's, I can't think of the right word, but to say that we're going to tax these businesses and they're going to absorb that cost, they're going to pass that cost on to consumers. There's a reason online businesses collect your zip code, because they tax you where you live. So while I do support this, I'm alarmed at being the first one on the bandwagon. I'd like to see, and I don't know if the committee's looking at this, but demographics of residents that do recycle versus residents that don't, and see what those barriers are. I would guess that at least half of our population has barriers to being able to recycle at their home. I know it's very expensive for businesses to recycle, so the industry itself creates a position to say it's cheaper just to give us your trash. So again, I do support recycling. I think it is the way to go. But I would like to see some other, municipalities, other states, in the fight as well.
Did you want to speak to that, Sarah?
I could speak to that. There are a handful of other states that are looking at this now. Maine's just a little further along. Many states are struggling with recycling, so they're all working on policies like this, but we just happen to have this route with the resolve that makes the DEP write it, that's put us ahead of others. And I will say that everybody, like my counterparts in other states, we're all working together on this legislation so that it can be replicated in other states. So we really do have that kind of de-rigueur opportunity to lead the nation in this, which is really exciting. And I will note that Maine has been the first in many of the product stewardship laws. So it's really not new territory for our state, and it's actually a policy of our state to use product stewardship as a waste management strategy. We have a product stewardship framework law that was passed in 2010. So it's Maine has kind of always been a leader in this way. And just a little bit more about the cost of goods question. So when I first started learning about this years ago, I would have a hard time advocating for a policy that I thought was going to significantly raise, let's say, grocery bills or consumers' monthly bills. So me and my colleagues have been searching far and wide, talking to experts from around the world, trying to figure out if there's any evidence of costs increasing as a result of these policies. And we have yet to find one. And I think there's a few reasons why. One, it's hard to parse out what is causing a product to increase. But others, when you even, so when you break out the costs distributed over all the manufacturers, it's really not a lot. It is fractions of a penny per container, maybe at most 2 pennies for the most wasteful packaging. And that's typically not enough to tip the scales to charge more. And then even when you look at the bottle bill, say for instance, only some states have the bottle bill, but the cost of beverages is the same everywhere. And another example is, say, in there's 5 provinces in Canada that have an EPR for packaging program. Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick are all wanting one too. And one of the reasons that Nova Scotia gave is because they did some research and noticed they're paying the same prices as people in British Columbia and Quebec and Ontario and all these places that have this law, but they're getting none of the benefits of having their recycling programs, getting help for their recycling programs. And to me, this is the only way that, if you do care about recycling, that we're ever going to reach our 50% recycling goal, without throwing even more taxpayer dollars at it. It's kind of like somebody's going to be paying for this. Right now, taxpayers are paying in Maine $16 to $17.5 million a year on managing packaging waste. And that was, the DEP reported that in their last year's product stewardship report. And that breaks down to $11 to $13 annually per capita that taxpayers are already paying for this. So we're just asking for the producers to instead roll that into their cost of business and help our municipalities out. And then when you look at the annual per capita costs from all over the world, it's all very similar to that. It's in the same range as what we're paying here, except for in other places, producers are paying all or most of that. And in here, it's all taxpayers, and we have about half the recovery rate as all those other places. So it's kind of like someone's paying, what's the most fair way to distribute those costs?
Are you all set, Councilor Penny? Yep. Councilor Lyson?
Yes, thank you. Reading the recycling reform, which is before us, I went through all the whereases, and some of them were things that the city has really had in our radars is how the market's shrunk, and how, we've got some advantages in our programs, but that can't hold into the future. I think we need something like this. So I read the whereases and I'm weighing, where do you disagree with the whereases in this? And then, you're looking at what's effective, sustainable, and equitable. I think those are all key principles on how we ought to run our communities and state. And I really, if we're out front, let them follow, because others will, if it's a good idea, and I think it's a good idea. So obviously you take risks whatever you do, but this one seems like a very simple, it's a shift of responsibility with those who package stuff. And if you're a consumer of goods, you know how things have changed over time. The solution to the bags is bringing your own grocery bag, right, every time you go. So that's cultural shifts and changes that occur. Also, I think these people will realize that, hey, if we can just design our packaging differently to make it more recyclable, we'll reduce those costs, and hey, everybody wins then. You know what I mean? It's like, so I just think a resolve like this, talking about recycling reform is just what the state needs, and I think the DEP needs encouragement that communities across the state, some who are abandoning recycling, and we've talked about, if it's a cost to us, do we really want to recycle? And we've had that discussion here at the council during the budgetary processes. And to me, if we don't continue to recycle, and I think this is a type of reform and program, the legislature's already passed it. It needs to be implemented. And I think the DEP needs to know that there are communities like Lewiston out there that really want to recycle. And, especially if it's more cost effective. And it seems like, we're protecting. I hear fellow councilors talk about not wanting to raise costs to the consumer or to the taxpayers or to the community. I think this will do just the opposite. I think in the long run, we'll save money, get more recyclable, and therefore be more effective, more sustainable, and more equitable. So, thank you.
Counselor Beam.
I just want to say we have to start somewhere, and we're doing recycling, and we are looking into the recycle committee is looking into the barriers that keep people from recycling right here in our little town in Lewiston. But this is a big initiative, and Quebec has been doing it for 15 years and doesn't seem to have had any bad results. I mean, it's a proven, it seems like it's a proven a tactic to use to reduce some of the waste that goes into our landfills. I shopped at Whole Foods the other day, and it was like walking into a different world, and it isn't really that different, but they have been able to make changes, like for instance, the cloth bags. Well, not everybody, most people who walk into Whole Foods will bring their cloth bags. Also, they have a lot of ways of not using plastic bags. I don't think I saw a plastic bag being used, except maybe with the produce, and for that, they do have their own recycle for that, which Hannaford does too, I know, but it was really, really different. We could change things, and this kind of change, all it's saying is, let's switch it a little bit, because these people are just packaging this stuff way too much. We really don't need that much packaging. We don't need all this plastic stuff and on fish, for instance, that you buy, and all you need is a piece of paper rolled around it, and it's done. So, and I read an article that said that you could put your vegetables in your you don't have to put it in a plastic bag to get it made. You can just put it in your cloth bag and wash it when you get home, for heaven's sakes, and wash your bag and you're all set. So it's a little things. This is a great big thing, and I don't think we should be scared of it at all. And as I forget who was saying this, but the nitty-gritty can be worked out, and we can, the legislature obviously is going to work on this, right? And they'll vote on it, and all we're saying is, hey, let's try this, and we support this kind of thinking. I'm done.
Great, thank you. I just want to voice my support for this particular resolve moving forward as well. And I really want to thank Councilor Beam and the members of the Recycling Committee for taking this on the municipality side, and then NRCM for looping in the state voice as well for what's been going on with that and all of the research that you all have done. I think we do have to do something, as Councilor Beam just thoughtfully said, and so this feels like a good move forward. And hopefully as more details flesh out, perhaps the recycling committee can offer some testimony in Augusta and work with the city councilors who are here then, and continue this conversation between municipalities and the state, because we have been footing the bill for this, and we have to take some action. So thank you all very much. Is there any further comment before we release these folks? Oh, Councilor Marcotte.
I'd just like to say before the resolve comes to us in the form of an agenda item, that you take a good look at the therefore be it resolved. I mean, I have no problem with the whereas, as was mentioned earlier, but it's the be it resolved that makes a reference to another resolve to support municipal recycling programs, LD 1431, and when you flip to the next page, that's the resolve that I was initially referring to or referencing, and that's where it talks about an emergency preamble. Well, that should be eliminated if that's the case. When I look down at the last couple of sections, Section 2, proposed legislation resolved, and the following page, it says emergency clause. There it is again. And in the summary, it refers to no later than December 16, 2019, so that date's in the future. I have to wonder whether that's the resolve that we're actually supporting with an internal resolve. So need to make sure that all the i's are dotted and the t's are crossed before it comes back, so that there are no flaws in it.
So only including the committee amended law instead of the previous workshopped one is what you're asking for, is that correct?
Yeah.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the resolve that you're looking at, this one,
It's super confusing.
that is what was provided to the legislature to craft the legislative law, which is LD 1431. LD 1431 right now is the committee amendment.
In the other packet.
Yes.
Okay, so there's just some
The issue is
confusion.
that there's confusion because we've gotten 3 packets now.
So if we could just clear that up when this resolve comes to us as supporting
It
documentation.
was not my intention to
I know,
include
I
any
know,
of this,
I
any of the
know.
actual legislation in the packet, because quite honestly, to do that, I have to retype it, because they don't take the amendments and shove them into the full bill. They give you they give you the bill, an Amendment A, an Amendment B, and Amendment Z, and you're expected to somehow figure this out. Drives me crazy during the session when they do it. The intention, I think, of referencing 1431 is as adopted by the legislature, which incorporates the amendment.
What's confusing
Is the way the packet is
is
organized.
this.
Yeah.
This shouldn't have been included at all, I don't think.
The original draft. So, just
Well,
in the,
except the amendment doesn't always give you the whole
But
bill.
that's not, this isn't even the original.
Sarah, is this in
isn't
your
even the
packet?
bill.
No, I haven't seen the packet, so the recycling
We have a
committee
letter
put that
from you,
together.
though.
That one, yes, I wrote the letter with
Excellent.
the draft resolution language,
Okay.
is what we've been giving to municipalities. And I'll say, you can edit that resolution language in any way that you're comfortable with. And it's just a way, like I said, just a way to say, City of Lewiston supports this idea of the legislature considering this. So it's really kind of risk-free, and even if you said, you know what, once you see the bill, I don't like it, take us off your list, that's fine too. But that's really, that's really the purpose of it.
The issue, Ed, is that we've gotten this, and then we've also gotten the actual bill and the committee amendment. And
Yeah.
this is what was used to draft the bill, so this is actually no longer relevant.
But yeah, that doesn't look
to us.
familiar to me, that document there.
We will recycle these pages.
I would recycle those pages, yes. You just care about, like, the bill that passes LD 1431, directing
Yes.
DP to do that. And basically, the whereas statements that were on that are the same that was on that bill as in the resolution.
Great, so we'll clarify that for when it comes back. When do you anticipate that happening, Ed?
Well, it could be on the next agenda, but I still don't, the committee amendment doesn't include the whereases. I mean, I would just as soon not include any of that, just leave the reference at 1431
Yes,
Yes.
as adopted.
correct.
Yeah, and not include any of the actual bills if it's that confusing.
Right.
Excellent.
And I'll say, I have an example of what the town of Kingfield did. They just basically put their letterhead on the top of the resolution language, and then all of the counselors signed it.
Yeah, we have a
Yeah,
form.
so you have one of those, yeah. So you would just put in whatever form is comfortable for you and do that.
Great, so we will see this on November 19th?
Correct.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thank
We'll
you.
move on to item number 2, update of city tree planting programs.
Okay, there is a copy of a policy included in your agenda, tree planting policy of the city of Lewiston. This is coming forward because several council members approached us, and I guess some constituents had raised questions about the various programs and how they interacted. The city's historically had, I think, 3 separate programs. One is the routine tree replacements that we do or used to do when we had money to do them, when we take out a street tree or a tree in a park and replant that or put new ones in the public right-of-way. A second one is obviously the tree bait program, which the council adopted several years ago and is still in effect and still is funded. And then the third one is a program that hasn't really been a regular program, but it's been a program where periodically the city council would authorize the placement of trees on private property where there was no room in the public right-of-way, and we wanted to increase the tree canopy or tree presence in that neighborhood. Only done that, the one time I can remember is over in the Tree Street neighborhood, where we did that a number of years ago, where the council authorized us to do that. And I missed one, which is that for a period of time, we had a 50-50 program, which is if you wanted a tree, if you didn't have a street tree in front of your house, you could ask us to put one there, and we would split the cost with you. That program hasn't been funded in at least 10 years. So basically, it's on the books, or has been on the books in the past, but it's not funded. So what we're trying to do is pull all of this together in one place so that there's a consistent reference guide to people who want to find out what to do. And in the process, we made a couple little changes. On trees placed on private property by the city, section 4.0. Again, that would require us to get permission from the private property owner. As originally drafted, the city would get an easement that would allow us to maintain that tree. The proposal in front of you is to do that in perpetuity. As long as the tree's there, the city would continue to maintain it. I'm thinking we might want to put a time limit on that, because there is obviously some benefit to individuals if they want to have a tree there. Normally, we try to maintain those trees at least long enough to get them well established. So I was thinking that might make more sense than trying to keep track of which trees we own 50 years from now, and which ones we're responsible and which ones we're not responsible for. That's something I'm still talking with Dale Dowdy about, but you may want to chime in on your thoughts on that. On the tree bait program, we're making, I think, 2 basic changes. One is that in the past, as originally written, the program was eligible for only single-family and duplex properties. As we're proposing here, it would be properties in which an owner resided would be, and paid and received a homestead would be eligible. So it potentially pick up larger buildings that have more units in it, as long as the owner is the owner occupant, lives in one of the units. And then the other minor change on 5.4 in that section, the policy used to say that the tree had to be either visible from the public right-of-way or within 100 feet of the primary residential structure. We're changing the or to and, so that it's both visible and within close proximity, or within 100 feet of a property, of a building. Because we do want to have those, A, visible from the street, and B, associated with the developed area of a property. So it's not as important to have something planted out in the hayfield on a 40-acre parcel as it is to have something around the house that's on that parcel. So those are basically the changes we're making, trying to pull this all together in one place instead of having it in various places, and then clarifying a couple of things about the tree bait program. One thing that's still up in the air is whether we want to maintain trees on private property on which we have easements forever, or just for a period of time until those trees are well established.
So a couple things. Your numbering after 5.4 is incorrect, unfortunately. So planting location requirements would be 5.5, actually, looks like.
You're right. This is what happens when you let Microsoft rule your life.
The robots. The second thing is, so when this came to me from constituents, one thing that was, kind of contested, and I think something we should definitely consider, is why should this only apply to owner-occupied properties when folks might want to beautify their property for their tenants, and they're putting money in and investing in their property otherwise? Is there reasoning behind that? Could we all discuss that and see if that's...
The reason behind it is would be aimed at Lewiston residents, not necessarily Lewiston business owners. That was the basic idea. But obviously, it would be if you wanted to make it open to everyone for any residential property, that would be up to you folks.
Oh, lots of people have thoughts. Mayor Claudia.
So I like the expansion to all multifamilies in the tree bait program, but I would agree with Councilor Ray that what I've heard is that limiting it to residents means that a lot of properties that may be in most need of beautification aren't eligible for the program. So I would support opening it up.
Counselor Pettingill?
Normally, I'm all for, advocating for Lewiston first. But if we want street trees, sorry, in the city, opening it up to, multifamilies benefits us greatly, and having street trees is an asset to the city in dozens and dozens of ways, so I think it would.
One quick clarification, that the tree bait program is not required that they be on the street or in the front.
No, I
Visible.
think having that in there is good, so that way it's visible from the street.
Yes.
But I do think we should take out the part of the owner occupant on the multifamilies. I think that would benefit us greatly.
Counselor Marcotte?
I'd agree with that sentiment, and I'm also curious as to, I remember we stripped some of the funding from the tree bait program because it wasn't being fully utilized.
Correct.
And it would be nice to know what the anticipation would be on usage if we expanded wholesale.
Yeah, I will,
Hopefully a lot.
that tree bait program, we have not had a huge amount of usage after the last discussion where we took some money out of the program because it wasn't being used. We did pick up some use, but I can get updated numbers for you for the use of the program. I quite honestly don't anticipate a significant increase in demand by opening it up to all residential properties. I think it's unlikely that a non-resident landlord would, A, know about the program and B, participate in it, but it's possible, some may.
Well, if it's limited use, I don't see any problem expanding it then.
Well, it could be a resident and not a resident in the building, though.
That's possible, sure.
And then your other question, in terms of timing, what, is that under 4.2, rights for planting and maintenance, maintaining a tree on their property for the duration of its life? Is that the part you're talking about?
Yes,
for
that's for programs where the city decides that an area of the city needs to have trees planted, that there may be limitations on where those trees can go, and we decide to try to find private property on which to plant trees. The proposal coming from Public Works is to effectively take on maintenance responsibilities for those trees for the life of the tree. That kind of scares me from a couple points of view. One is it's a long period of time. Second, there's no guarantee we're going to be able to keep track of it. I can see us having all kinds of interesting discussions with property owners about whether it's our tree or not our tree. I don't think we're actually going to file formal easements in the registry because there's a cost associated with that. In fact, it may be that when we actually do this, it'd be more like a license than an easement that would run with the property. So my thinking was for a period of time, for, say for a 5-year period, to make sure that the tree actually gets established, that we would take responsibility for it, but then it would become responsibility of the landowner.
I don't hate that. Counselor Pettingill?
No, I'm opposed to that. One of the,
You are opposed?
yeah, I think if we're putting the trees out there, we should take care of them. I had a constituent reach out who's over 80, who the city maintained the tree for a while, and then just stopped, and then sporadically took care of it. He was unable to do that due to his age. So if we're putting these out there with the easements to take care of them, I think we should do that.
Counselor Marcotte?
Are you talking about trees that are on the person's
Private
property?
property.
Private property, not the right-of-way in front
Correct.
of.
It's right-of-way trees we're responsible for.
I have no problem with making it the landowner's responsibility after a period of time.
Further weigh-ins on that topic, because we're split.
Yeah, I'm in support of
Of a 5-year?
of a limited time. One of the other things that is like
Could you speak into it?
Yes, I'm sorry. Trees that have, are out of scale or out, sometimes you want to go in and take them down, too. So, I mean, is that maintenance as well? So, I think that eventually, I mean, we need to shift the responsibility to the landowner,
Yeah,
especially if it's on the right of way.
And I think that's a good point that I hadn't even thought of. There are times when people purchase property, and for whatever reason, they don't like the tree where it is, or it blocks shade to the house, or, I've seen, in my own neighborhood, I've seen people take out really nice, healthy trees and make them disappear because they wanted more sunlight. So I think, I don't necessarily want to get into an argument with a property owner 10 years down the road where are the trees there and he or she decides that they would rather not have it there.
Any further comments or questions? You have the direction you need.
Well, I guess I'm going to put in a period of time, and we'll see if people want to discuss that and amend it when it comes to the council.
Great.
And you're going to make the changes to
The changes for owner, sorry.
Right, and we'll make it the
Under
program
eligibility and then also
all
renumbering.
to all residential property.
Wonderful. Great, thanks. We'll move on to item number 3, small cell ordinance.
Yes. One of the things that's going on in the telecommunications industry is the potential for rolling out 5G telecommunications, and even on a more interim basis, as we've seen recently in Lewiston, when cell phone companies run into an area where they have either poor service or an excess demand, they have started installing small cell transmitters. And I have some pictures so you can get an idea of what these look like. We actually have a bunch of these in town. Somewhere around 35 or so have been installed. And as 5G rolls out, 5G requires that these transmitters be placed relatively close together, somewhere between 300, 600, 900 feet, depending on the topography that you're dealing with, buildings that are in the way, trees, things like that. In addition, most cellular companies have their own small cells. So if you have 4 or 5 major companies trying to provide a service in your community, you are liable to have 4 or 5 of these installed basically on almost every block in town. So it's a significant amount of infrastructure that's being put in. The other thing that's going on is that there has been action at both the state and the federal level to limit communities' ability to regulate the placement, location, and costs or fee bases for handling all of these kinds of things. So the state, as an example, recently passed legislation, and the municipal community was participated in this and actually negotiated a compromise with the cellular companies. These installations are exempted from all local land use regulations, effectively land use zoning plans. And the feds have basically said that you cannot restrict them. You have to allow them virtually anywhere. So if you have an area in town where you have no poles, everything's underground, you have to allow them in that area because they have to be able to serve their customers, and you can't put small cell installations underground. So one of the things that a group of municipalities in the state have done, and looking not just at our state, but what is being done in other states, is tried to put together a model ordinance that could be used to try to guide and regulate to some extent the impact of these kinds of installations throughout the community. So that's in, draft of that is in your packet, and we also did one other thing, and that is we pulled in the whole pole permitting process. As you know, utilities in the state of Maine have free right of access to the public right-of-way in order to install their facilities. In our case, most of the poles in town are owned by Consolidated Communications. Some are owned by CMP, and we have a few, but most of them are privately owned. Those poles, they're there by right. The state allows them to go into our right-of-way. We do have, however, the authority to permit them. Historically, permits have cost $10 under state law. States set that up, so anytime a party wanted to put a pole in, they pay a $10 fee, we would look at it, review it, and approve it. A lot of times in the past, to be quite honest, I don't think the city's taken its responsibilities seriously enough to look at pole placement. And as a result, we have throughout the city, telephone poles that violate the Americans with Disabilities Act, and telephone poles that are just in the wrong place, and/or, I don't know if you've noticed them, but sometimes they put these guy wires on to hold the poles up, and some of them are not high enough for our sidewalk plows to go under. So there are all these kinds of issues that come up about poles. We have started taking this a little bit more seriously, and as a result, we wanted to include in this regulation, in this chapter, better regulations and controls over the whole process of putting poles into our community. So I'm going to run through some of the big things here, not necessarily through all of it because it's pretty lengthy, but starting with the first page, section 71-12. This just details what's required to request a permit. We basically, in the past, have not really had standards, just whatever the utility provided to us. So this basically outlines what we would be looking at. We are proposing a new fee for handling a pole permit because the pole permit has to come into the clerk's office. They have to check to make sure everything's filled out, then goes to Public Works that does an analysis and a site visit. And right now, we're charging $10 for that. So clearly, we're not recovering our own costs in that, so we have some fees later on.
Is that the $50?
We have a section on sidewalks in the Americans with Disability Act.
Ed, are the fees the $50 on the last page?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
We have a section on sidewalks and the ADA, where, again, this reflects, we did make a change in our local ordinance to put some of this in, but this pulls it together into a more consolidated location. And we're probably going to make a couple of changes. Right now, we require 60 inches of clearance. Later on, it says that we could give a waiver to go down to 48 inches. We're probably going to increase that to 54 inches because 48 inches is not big enough, again, for our sidewalk plows. And where it says everything has to be, at least guy wires and things have to be 7 feet above the sidewalk, we're going to make that 8, again, to ensure that our sidewalk equipment can get under those without running into a problem. Replacement poles, we don't require a new permit, but we do require that if they put something in, they have to make sure they don't screw up the right-of-way even any further. You may have noticed the famous pole on Ash Street with the big bow in it. You may have noticed that they came out and put a new pole in. They moved it back further on the sidewalk and made the situation worse, and Dale has been after them to get that rectified. So just again, they can't worsen the situation with a new pole. Some other things that are in here that we're still checking with legal to see if we can get away with or not legally under state requirements is when the utilities put a new pole in, I don't know if you've noticed, but it sometimes takes years for the old pole to go away. And for example, right over by Adams Avenue and Park Street, you turn onto Adams, you will notice that they replaced the poles there, but they now have 2 poles. The new pole's been there for over a year, and the old pole has not yet been removed because I think the cable company still may be up on it. One of the companies is still up on the pole. So we want to set a time limit for them to do that because they're, in particular, again, they're violating ADA by having the 2 poles. If they had 1 pole, they'd probably be okay. But with the 2 poles, one of the older poles has a big, large base associated with it. So we want to give them some standard. We're not sure if we can legally do that or not, but I think we're talking to our attorneys and the folks at MMA. That may be something. There is actually an effort, and there's legislation that was carried over in the legislature to establish this as a standard. So even if we don't get it, maybe the state will be able to do it for us. Section 7115, historically, there has always been a quote-unquote public space on the poles. In return for getting free use of right-of-way, there's a public space allowed on the poles for the city to use for police power, public safety kinds of uses. And what has happened is, since all municipalities don't use all of that space, the utilities have gradually used that space over time. And if the city then wanted to get its space back, it had to pay the utilities to relocate out of its space, which never made a whole lot of sense. And this came out when Sanford got involved in a project to try to tie into the three-ring binder to bring high-speed internet into their community. They had to pay a very significant bill to get everybody to pay the make-ready fee to get out of the space on the pole that's supposed to be theirs. The legislature has changed that. They passed a law saying we don't have to pay those fees anymore to get people out of that space. So we just want that referenced here in the law, in our ordinance, so that people are familiar with it. And that's pretty much most of the major things, along with an 180-day notice to relocate a pole for a project. Again, that is frequently a problem. There have been situations in the state where people have basically almost paved around old poles that haven't been removed because utilities don't get to them in time. I know we had some delays on the school project up at Franklin Pasture because of utility pole relocation. So this would set a standard, give you a 180-day notice if you're going to have to move your poles. The second part here, which is much longer, is on the small cell wireless issue. And again, there's a lot of definitions and things like that that I don't necessarily think we need to go through in any detail. But some of the major points are that, number one, they would need a permit, so that they would have to come in and get a permit. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is we need to know where these things are because there are some limitations on how close employees can work to them. And a lot of these are on utility poles on which we have street lighting, so that our employees are going to be working around them. We need to know who owns them so we can contact them to have them turned off if we have to do some work. We really need to have the ability to take at least a quick look at the pole location. We don't want someone to get a permit to put a small cell on top of a pole that either is already in violation of ADA or that we know we're going to be removing or asking to move at some point because of a construction project or something like that. The utilities may not know that, so it gives us a chance to check that. So there would be a permit needed. There's an application process that's outlined in the ordinance about what they have to provide us. Again, one of the difficulties, a lot of these small cells are installed not by AT&T or Verizon. They're installed by contractors of, or they're third-party owners who contract with the companies. So one of the difficulties is we need to know for sure who they are. We need to have some assurance that if we have a problem, if they abandon the installation, we know how to get rid of it, all of those kinds of things. So just trying to get the right amount of information. And then we want to stress co-location as a preferred option as opposed to single location poles. We're going to have all of these things in the community. We have enough poles already. We really would prefer not to have any additional poles put in just for small cell use. So there's a process where they can get permission to do that if there's no other alternative, but they really have to look at what they can come up with to co-locate before they can put in a pole on their own. Again, there's a possibility of us asking for some form of surety or bond to ensure that the pole's removed or the installation's removed if it's no longer being used. And again, that's because it's not like the other poles that tend to be owned by a long-term publicly regulated utility. These are come and go, can potentially be come and go companies, things like that. And again, we outline fees, which I'll get to at the end. There are some limitations on size, how far out they can project from poles. Again, we have how high above the ground everything has to be, because these normally have, at least have electric meters on them, and many of them, or most of them, have a box. So there's the actual antenna, which is up at the top of the pole, and there's a box with the equipment in it, and then there's an electric meter, and again, we want that stuff up high enough that either we're not hitting it when we're plowing around it, or that the public doesn't walk down and whap their head on it, because it sticks out into the sidewalk. There's standards for review set out on how we would review these things. There's language that allows us to have some aesthetic control in historic districts and special areas, like where we have no above-ground utilities. It would have to put in some kind of aesthetic pole, things like that. It's kind of interesting in parts. There's an article I ran across in there's a suburb of Denver where all of the utilities are underground. And of course, the small cell people showed up and started putting in poles for small cells because they have to be above ground. And it's created quite a hassle in that neighborhood, in part because the poles that they were putting in were ugly. So again, it's trying to come up with something that fits in, that matches the neighborhood, that doesn't just, we don't want a wooden pole on Lisbon Street, as an example. We are suggesting that if they're installing one within a historic district or adjacent to a historic building, that they would have to apply for and get a certificate of appropriateness from the city's Historic Preservation Committee. So I think those are most of the general requirements that we're talking about here. And the fees we're talking about are for a new pole permit, that's a typical utility pole, be $50 permit per pole. There are fines set out for violating the ADA, failure to remove abandoned poles, and failure to relocate poles at $50 per day per pole. That one would hope would give them an incentive to get those poles taken down. On the small cell side, the fees we're suggesting here are what I'll call the safe harbor fees that the Federal Communications Commission has indicated they feel are reasonable. The Federal they have really gotten into this and have really regulated around it. For example, there's a time limit. If we get an application for a small cell, there's a time limit in which we must respond to that application. So they have really tried to make it as, and there's some logic to this. I mean, it kind of bothers people that they're taking away a lot of local control, but clearly these are high-tech installations that need to be done if we want to utilize that technology. And if there are a lot of barriers in the way, it's very hard for these companies to deal with it. In Maine, for example, if they're dealing with, 200 planning boards to get permission, that becomes very difficult for them to do. So in that process, they set out what they felt were reasonable fees that they felt would be supportable. $250 for an initial application for anywhere from 1 to 5 of these permits, and then $50 each for each additional one beyond 5. And then we're talking about an after-the-fact permit, because we do have some of these that went out there without a permit. They did get an electrical permit, but they did not get a utility location permit. So we would like to at least get them into the system so we know where they are and who owns them and how to contact them. This is not quite ready for prime time yet, because we need to do a little bit more work and some of it needs to be cleaned up, and I'm counting on Councilor Ray to give us some advice on
2 typos.
proofreading. Yeah, I noticed some today when I went through it myself. She's our favorite proofreader, by the way. But I did want to at least get this out there so you know what we're talking about, where we're going, and this, again, is based off of a model ordinance that was prepared by Maine Municipal Association, working with a number of communities.
Questions from the council? Councilor Marcotte.
Small cell and 5G, is those synonymous?
To some extent, yes and no. 5G is based on a small cell system, but there are also small cells out there that are not 5G. They're filling in areas of poor coverage or areas of excess demand.
So 5G would not be available outside a urban setting?
That is probably correct, given the number of these that they're going to have to be putting in. I mean, that's a huge number that are going to be required. I don't know when 5G will get here even, because we're going to start with the big cities with lots of population. Because it must be, I don't know what these cost per installation, but it's got to be pretty expensive.
Further questions from the council? Great, thank you for the information. Do I hear a motion?
Yes, I'd like to make a motion to enter into an executive session pursuant to MRSA Title I, Section 405(6)(c), to discuss an economic development issue of which the premature disclosure of the information would prejudice the competitive bargaining position of the city.
Second.
A motion from Councilor Lyson, seconded by Councilor LaJoy. All those in favor? All those opposed? One abstention. Have fun.
Yes, Councilor Ray has a conflict on this item and will be going home.
Thanks.